53 soldiers. That's how many Americans were inside the wire when the mountains came alive. 53 men stationed at the bottom of a valley so steep that the enemy could fire downward into every position on the base from 3 sides simultaneously. The mortar pit was hit in the first 90 seconds. The ammunition supply point went up 4 minutes later. Within 10 minutes, insurgents had breached the perimeter and were inside the outpost, moving between burning buildings, firing at Americans who were still pulling on their boots. A young private named Kevin Thompson was killed by a single round to the face before he could fire a shot. He had been in Afghanistan for 5 months. He was 22 years old. 8,000 miles away, in a classified briefing room beneath the Ministry of Defense in Whitehall, a British liaison officer who had been monitoring the attack in real time through a secure intelligence feed turned to his colleague and said 6 words that no one in the room would forget. "We told them this would happen." He wasn't guessing. He wasn't speculating. He was referencing a specific warning delivered months earlier by British military advisors who had spent decades learning the exact lessons that the American commanders at Combat Outpost Keating had not yet absorbed. A warning rooted in 40 years of counterinsurgency experience stretching from the streets of Belfast to the jungles of Malaya, from the deserts of Oman to the mountains of Borneo. A warning that said, in language far more diplomatic than the truth required, your men aren't ready for the fight you're sending them into, and you're putting them in a position that guarantees they'll have to fight it on the enemy's terms. That warning was ignored. And on the morning of October 3, 2009, in a valley called Kamdesh in Afghanistan's Nuristan province, the cost of ignoring it was paid in blood. To understand how 53 American soldiers ended up defending an indefensible position against 300 Taliban fighters, you have to understand the strategic architecture that put them there. And to understand why the British saw the disaster coming, you have to understand what the British had learned across 6 decades of fighting the kind of wars that America was only beginning to comprehend. The year was 2006. The war in Afghanistan was entering its 5th year, and the initial confidence that had characterized the early campaigns was eroding rapidly. The Taliban, which had been scattered in the opening months of Operation Enduring Freedom, had regrouped in Pakistan's federally administered tribal areas and was flowing back across the border in increasing numbers. The insurgency was metastasizing. Improvised explosive devices were detonating at a rate of roughly 80 per week across the country. Coalition forces were losing soldiers at a pace that was difficult to sustain politically in Washington and London. And in the remote eastern provinces of Kunar and Nuristan, where the Hindu Kush mountains rise to nearly 5,000 meters, and the valleys are so narrow that sunlight reaches the floor for only a few hours each day, the situation was deteriorating faster than anywhere else in the theater. The American strategy in these provinces was built on a concept that sounded logical in a Pentagon briefing room, but proved catastrophic on the ground. The idea was to establish a network of small combat outposts, manned by platoon and company-sized elements, along the Afghan-Pakistani border. These outposts would serve a dual purpose. They would interdict the flow of insurgent fighters and weapons coming across the border from Pakistan's tribal areas. And they would function as hubs for counterinsurgency operations, building relationships with local populations through reconstruction projects, medical assistance, and economic development. In theory, the outposts would win hearts and minds while simultaneously degrading the enemy's ability to move freely. The British had heard this theory before. They had heard it in Malaya in 1948, when colonial administrators believed that fortified positions in the jungle would contain the communist insurgency. They had heard it in Kenya during the Mau Mau uprising. They had heard it in Aden. They had heard versions of it in Northern Ireland, where the initial deployment of troops in 1969 was based on assumptions about population control that took 3 decades and over 3,500 deaths to fully dismantle. And across every one of these campaigns, the British military had learned a lesson that it had tried, repeatedly and with diminishing patience, to communicate to its American allies. The lesson was this: Static positions in hostile territory, no matter how well fortified, no matter how well supplied, become targets. They become magnets for enemy activity. They telegraph your intentions to the population. They tie down troops in defensive postures when they should be moving. And in terrain where the enemy holds the high ground, where the local population is, ambivalent at best and hostile at worst, where supply lines are vulnerable and reinforcements are hours away, a static position is not a base. It is a trap. The British military's experience with this reality was not abstract. It was written in scar tissue. In Northern Ireland, the British Army had established a network of fortified bases, watchtowers, and observation posts across the province. Some of these positions, particularly in the rural border areas of South Armagh, became the targets of sustained and increasingly sophisticated IRA attacks. The Provisional IRA learned to study the routines of the garrisons, to map the dead ground around each position, to identify the moments of vulnerability during shift changes and resupply operations. The watchtowers along the border became symbols not of British strength, but of British exposure. Soldiers manning them were targeted by snipers using high-powered rifles. Resupply convoys were ambushed with roadside bombs. The positions were maintained at enormous cost in manpower, equipment, and lives, and their contribution to the overall counterinsurgency campaign was, by the assessment of numerous British military analysts, marginal at best. The lesson was absorbed. By the time the British deployed to Afghanistan in significant numbers in 2006, taking responsibility for Helmand Province in the south, the institutional memory of Northern Ireland was embedded in the doctrine, the training, and the instincts of every officer and senior NCO in the force. When British commanders looked at the American strategy of scattering small outposts across the Afghan-Pakistani border, they saw a pattern they recognized, and they were alarmed. The specific warning regarding the vulnerability of American combat outposts in eastern Afghanistan was communicated through multiple channels across 2007 and 2008. It was not a single document, a single meeting, or a single conversation. It was a sustained effort by British military liaison, personnel, intelligence officers, and senior advisors embedded within the coalition command structure to communicate what they believed was a fundamental flaw in the American operational approach. The core of the British concern was threefold. First, the outposts were positioned in terrain that gave every tactical advantage to the attacker. Valleys in Nuristan and Kunar are steep-sided and narrow. The bases were typically established on valley floors because that was where the population centers were, where the roads ran, and where helicopters could land. But this meant that insurgents occupying the surrounding high ground could fire directly into the compounds from ranges of 300 to 800 meters, while the defenders were forced to shoot uphill into positions that were often invisible against the mountain backdrop. In military terms, the outposts occupied the worst possible ground. Second, the outposts were isolated. The roads connecting them to larger bases were unpaved, narrow, and subject to ambush. In many cases, the road network was so degraded or so dangerous that ground resupply was impossible, and all logistics had to come by helicopter. But helicopter landing zones at the outposts were themselves within range of enemy fire, meaning that every resupply mission was a combat operation. Apache attack helicopters and close air support were typically based at Jalalabad, approximately 30 minutes of flight time away. In the event of a major attack, the garrison would have to survive for at least 30 minutes, likely longer, before air support arrived. Against an enemy that had learned to mass fighters quickly, attack with overwhelming force, and withdraw before aircraft could engage, 30 minutes was an eternity. Third, and most critically in the British assessment, the troops manning many of these outposts were not adequately prepared for the specific type of warfare they were being asked to fight. This was not a criticism of American courage or competence. It was a recognition that the conventional army units rotating through Afghanistan were trained primarily for a different kind of war. They were trained for maneuver warfare, for combined arms operations, for the kind of fighting where superior firepower, mobility, and technology would produce decisive results. What they were being asked to do in Nuristan and Kunar was something altogether different. They were being asked to conduct counterinsurgency operations in some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth, among a population that had been resisting foreign armies since Alexander the Great lost men in those same mountain passes in 330 BC. They were being asked to build relationships with tribal elders whose loyalties shifted with the wind, to gather intelligence in communities where every stranger was noted and reported, to defend positions that the British would have described as tactically untenable, and to do all of this with units that rotated through on 12 to 15-month deployments, meaning that every new unit had to rebuild relationships from scratch. The British knew what this looked like because they had done it themselves, imperfectly and at great cost, in Northern Ireland. The British Army's deployment in the province had lasted 38 years, from 1969 to 2007. It was the longest continuous military operation in British history, and the central lesson of those 38 years was that counterinsurgency is not a sprint. It is an ultramarathon. It requires patience measured in decades, not months. It requires intelligence networks built on personal relationships that take years to cultivate. It requires an understanding of local culture, tribal dynamics, and political grievances that cannot be acquired in a pre-deployment training package. And above all, it requires an acceptance that military force alone, no matter how overwhelming, cannot solve a problem that is fundamentally political. The Americans at Combat Outpost Keating were trying to compress this process into a single deployment cycle. They were trying to build trust with local elders while simultaneously conducting combat operations against insurgents who often came from the same communities. They were trying to establish a permanent presence in terrain that punished permanence, and they were doing it in a position that had been identified as indefensible from the day it was established. Combat Outpost Keating was built in 2006 as part of Operation Mountain Lion, a U.S. Army initiative to extend coalition presence into the remote valleys of Nuristan province. The site was chosen for its proximity to the Pakistani border, where 3 valley systems converged, creating a natural corridor for insurgent movement between Afghanistan and Pakistan's tribal areas. The intent was to block this corridor and to establish contact with the local Nuristani population, an ethnically distinct group that had never been fully integrated into the Afghan state. The location was, by any standard of military science, a disaster. The outpost sat on the valley floor at the confluence of the Lande Sin River and a smaller tributary. Mountains rose steeply on 3 sides, reaching altitudes that gave any attacker a commanding field of fire into the base. The perimeter was difficult to defend because the terrain offered multiple avenues of approach that were concealed by boulders, trees, and the natural undulation of the mountainside. The single road connecting Keating to the nearest major base at Camp Blessing, approximately 8 kilometers to the south, was narrow, unpaved, and passed through terrain so treacherous that a vehicle accident on this road had killed the outpost's namesake, First Lieutenant Benjamin Keating, in November 2006, when his truck rolled off the road and into the river. After Keating's death, the road was deemed too dangerous for regular vehicle traffic. The outpost became almost entirely dependent on helicopter resupply. But the helicopter landing zone was itself within direct line of sight from multiple enemy firing positions in the surrounding mountains. Landing a helicopter at COP Keating was, as one pilot later described it, like landing at the bottom of a paper cup while someone shoots at you from the rim. Every commander who rotated through COP Keating recognized the problem. Staff Sergeant Clinton Romesha, who would later receive the Medal of Honor for his actions during the battle, described the position as being in a fishbowl. Multiple previous commanders had requested that the outpost be closed and the troops relocated to more defensible terrain. By late 2008, plans were in place to shut down COP Keating, but the closure was repeatedly delayed. First, by a lack of transportation assets, which were being consumed by operations elsewhere in the province. then by the search for Sergeant Bo Bergdahl, who went missing from his base in Paktika Province in June 2009, diverting helicopters and manpower away from the planned withdrawal. Then by bureaucratic inertia, the particular form of institutional paralysis that occurs when everyone knows something needs to happen, but no one has the authority or the will to make it happen immediately. The delays were fatal. Every week that COP Keating remained open gave the Taliban additional time to study the base, to map its defenses, to identify its weaknesses, and to plan an attack that would exploit all of them simultaneously. The British understood this dynamic with painful intimacy. In Northern Ireland, the IRA had demonstrated the same methodical approach to attacking fixed positions. The attack on the Narrow Water ambush in 1979, which killed 18 British soldiers in a single engagement, had been planned over months. The IRA had studied the patrol patterns, the response times, the likely reaction of the Quick Reaction Force. They had pre-positioned explosives and prepared secondary devices designed to catch the reinforcements. The operation was a masterclass in exploiting the predictability of a garrison force, and it remained one of the defining tactical defeats of the British campaign in Northern Ireland. The parallels with COP Keating were not lost on the British officers monitoring the situation in Nuristan. A garrison in a fixed position, surrounded by hostile terrain, dependent on predictable resupply routes, defended by a force that was too small to dominate the surrounding ground, and facing an enemy that had unlimited time to plan and prepare. The British had been here before. They had buried men because of it, and they were watching the Americans walk into the same trap. The warnings were delivered through formal channels and informal ones. British liaison officers at coalition headquarters in Kabul raised concerns about the vulnerability of isolated combat outposts during joint planning sessions. British intelligence analysts shared assessments of insurgent capability in the eastern provinces that highlighted the enemy's growing ability to mass fighters for coordinated attacks. Senior British officers, drawing on decades of experience in environments ranging from South Armagh to the Falklands to Sierra Leone, communicated their concerns directly to their American counterparts. But the warnings ran into a wall of institutional resistance that the British found frustratingly familiar. The American military culture in 2008 and 2009 was shaped by two powerful forces. The first was the success of the surge in Iraq, which had demonstrated that an aggressive posture, pushing troops into contested areas and refusing to cede ground, could produce dramatic results. The second was the counterinsurgency doctrine championed by General David Petraeus, which emphasized the importance of living among the population as a prerequisite for winning their trust. Both of these frameworks argued against abandoning outposts, even ones that were tactically questionable. Closing a base could be interpreted as retreat. It could signal weakness to the EU local population. It could cede territory to the enemy. In the metrics-driven culture of the American military, where progress was measured in territory held, projects completed, and shuras attended, abandoning a combat outpost was an admission of failure. The British saw things differently. Their experience in Northern Ireland had taught them that holding ground for the sake of holding ground was not a strategy. It was a liability. The British Army had eventually closed dozens of watchtowers, observation posts, and fortified bases across Northern Ireland, not because they were losing, but because they had learned that the costs of maintaining those positions outweighed their benefits. The positions tied down troops, provoked attacks, and generated casualties without meaningfully advancing the campaign. The real work of counterinsurgency, the intelligence gathering, the relationship building, the patient dismantling of insurgent networks happened through mobile operations, covert surveillance, and human intelligence networks that did not require a permanent physical footprint in every village and valley. This lesson, hard-won across decades of bitter experience, was precisely the lesson that the American command structure in Afghanistan was not yet ready to absorb. The institutional momentum behind the outpost strategy was too strong. The political pressure to show progress was too intense. and the cultural reluctance to accept that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is withdraw from a position that cannot be held was too deeply embedded in the American military ethos. In the months before the attack, the situation at COP Keating deteriorated steadily. The base had received 212 enemy contacts in the first 9 months of 2009, more than one every 2 days. Mortar rounds and rocket-propelled grenades fell with increasing regularity. Sniper fire from the surrounding ridgelines was a constant threat. The relationship with the local population, which had shown promise in the early years of the outpost's existence, had collapsed. A succession of commanding officers, each rotating through on short deployments, had failed to maintain the trust that had been painstakingly built by their predecessors. Promises of economic development had gone unfulfilled. A local Afghan man had been caught spying on the base with a cell phone, passing information about the layout and defenses to insurgent commanders. The previous outpost commander, Captain Robert Yeleskas, had been killed by an IED in December 2008. Morale was fragile. The sense of exposure was constant. In the weeks before the attack, coalition intelligence received 3 separate human intelligence reports indicating that insurgents were planning a major assault on COP Keating. The reports came from local sources, Afghan informants who risked their lives to pass along what they had heard. The intelligence was specific. A large force was being assembled. Fighters were moving into the area from multiple provinces. An attack was imminent. The reports were discounted. They had not been corroborated by signals intelligence or electronic surveillance. In the American intelligence framework, human intelligence from uncorroborated Afghan sources was treated with skepticism. The system required multiple sources, preferably including electronic intercepts, before a threat assessment would be elevated to a level that triggered a change in posture or an acceleration of the withdrawal timeline. The British approach to intelligence, shaped by decades of operating in environments where human sources were often the only reliable intelligence available, was fundamentally different. In Northern Ireland, the intelligence war had been won not by satellites or signals intercepts, but by agents, informants, and the patient cultivation of human sources within communities that were deeply suspicious of the security forces. The British had learned to trust human intelligence, to cross-reference it, with pattern-of-life analysis and on-the-ground observation, and to act on it even when electronic confirmation was unavailable. A warning from a local source that an attack was coming was not something to be filed and forgotten. It was something to act on immediately, because in counterinsurgency, by the time electronic surveillance confirms what a human source has already told you, the attack is usually underway. At COP Keating, the human intelligence was noted and filed. The withdrawal timeline was not accelerated. The defensive posture was not significantly altered. The trap remained set. At approximately 0300 hours on October 3, 2009, more than 300 Taliban-backed insurgents moved into the area around Kamdesh and ordered the villagers to evacuate. The locals complied. They knew what was coming. Some of them had likely helped plan it. The streets emptied, the shops closed. The village fell silent with the particular silence that precedes violence, the silence of people who know what is about to happen and have chosen to be elsewhere when it does. At 0600, the mountains erupted. The attack came from 3 sides simultaneously, a coordinated assault using mortars, rocket-propelled grenades, heavy machine guns, and concentrated small arms fire from positions that had been prepared and rehearsed over weeks, possibly months. The insurgents had studied the base with the same methodical patience that the IRA had applied to British positions in South Armagh. They knew where the mortar pit was, they knew where the ammunition was stored, they knew which positions could provide mutual support and which ones were isolated. They knew the dead ground, they knew the approach routes, they knew everything, because COP Keating had been sitting in the same spot for 3 years, and 3 years is more than enough time for an enemy with patience and local knowledge to learn everything there is to know about a position. The mortar pit was knocked out within the first 2 minutes. The Humvee-mounted weapon systems were targeted and suppressed. Private First Class Kevin Thompson was killed almost immediately, a single round to the face, while defending the northern mortar pit. Sergeant Joshua Kirk was struck by RPG shrapnel moments later. The volume of fire was staggering. Insurgents were firing from elevated positions on 3 sides, pouring rounds into a compound that offered minimal cover. The base began to burn. Structures that had been built from plywood and sandbags caught fire from tracer rounds and RPG impacts. Smoke filled the compound, reducing visibility to meters. Within the first 30 minutes, Taliban fighters had breached the perimeter in 3 places. They were inside the wire, moving between burning buildings, engaging American soldiers at ranges measured in meters. The fighting became close quarters, the kind of desperate, point-blank combat that leaves no room for error, no margin for hesitation, and no time for anything except the training that is burned into your muscle memory. What happened next was extraordinary. Not because the American soldiers failed, they fought with a courage that defies description. Staff Sergeant Clinton Romesha, despite being wounded by RPG shrapnel, organized a counterattack, rallied soldiers from scattered positions, and personally led a 5-man team to retake the southern portion of the outpost. Specialist Ty Carter ran through a hail of gunfire to reach a wounded comrade, Specialist Stephen Mace, who lay exposed in the open. Carter dragged Mace to cover, administered first aid, and continued fighting. Both Romesha and Carter would later receive the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest award for valor. Their actions, and the actions of every soldier at COP Keating that morning, represent the finest traditions of the American military. But courage was not the issue. Courage was never the issue. The British warning had never questioned the courage of American soldiers. What it had questioned was the system that put those soldiers in a position where courage was the only thing standing between them and annihilation. The system that placed a small garrison at the bottom of a valley, surrounded by mountains, connected to the outside world by a single helicopter landing zone that was within range of enemy fire, defended by fortifications that had not been improved because the base was scheduled for closure, warned by intelligence that was dismissed because it didn't meet the bureaucratic standard for corroboration, and reinforced by aircraft that were 30 minutes away. 8 American soldiers were killed. 27 were wounded. At least 4 Afghan National Army soldiers were also wounded, though exact Afghan casualty figures are disputed. The Taliban suffered losses estimated between 150 and 200 killed and wounded, though these numbers are difficult to verify because the Taliban carried their dead from the field. The base was partially overrun, and the remaining structures were burning when the last helicopters arrived to evacuate the survivors. 3 days later, COP Keating was abandoned. American aircraft were called in to destroy what remained of the base, ensuring that nothing of value was left for the insurgents. The position that had been built to project coalition influence into the Kamdesh Valley was reduced to rubble by the very forces it was supposed to protect. The aftermath of the Battle of Kamdesh sent shockwaves through the American military establishment. A formal investigation, the AR-15-6 report, was launched to examine the decisions that led to the disaster. The investigation concluded that the base should have been closed long before the attack. It criticized the delays that had kept the garrison in place. It noted the failure to act on human intelligence warnings. It questioned the decision to withhold resources for fortification improvements on the grounds that the base was scheduled for closure. The report was damning, but it addressed symptoms, rather than causes. The British officers who had been watching the situation unfold saw something deeper. They saw a pattern of institutional behavior that they recognized from their own painful history. A military establishment that was slow to learn from its mistakes, reluctant to challenge doctrinal assumptions, and organizationally incapable of admitting that a strategy was flawed until the evidence was written in casualties. The British had made similar mistakes themselves. In Helmand Province, the initial deployment in 2006 had gone badly wrong when British forces dispersed into isolated platoon houses across the province, creating exactly the kind of static positions that their own doctrine warned against. The decision, driven by political pressure from local Afghan officials and a desire to demonstrate presence across a wide area, resulted in months of intense fighting as Taliban forces besieged the isolated garrisons. The British eventually consolidated their positions and adjusted their approach, but not before suffering significant casualties and learning, once again, the lesson that their own institutional memory should have prevented them from needing to relearn. The difference was in the speed of adaptation. The British military, shaped by centuries of colonial warfare and decades of Northern Ireland experience, had developed an institutional reflex for recognizing when a position was untenable and withdrawing before the cost became catastrophic. This wasn't always true, and the British were capable of stubbornness that cost lives. But the cultural willingness to retreat from a bad position, to accept that withdrawal is sometimes the tactically correct decision, was more deeply embedded in British military culture than in its American counterpart. In the American system, retreat carried political and institutional costs that often outweighed the tactical benefits. A commander who closed a base could be accused of losing ground. A general who recommended consolidation could be seen as admitting failure. The metrics-driven culture of the American military in Afghanistan, where success was measured in territory held and projects completed, created incentives to maintain positions that should have been abandoned. COP Keating remained open for months after it should have been closed, not because anyone believed it was serving a useful purpose, but because closing it would have meant acknowledging that the strategy that put it there was wrong. The lessons of Kamdesh reverberated far beyond a single valley in Nuristan. In the months following the battle, General Stanley McChrystal, the top American commander in Afghanistan, accelerated the closure of isolated combat outposts across the eastern provinces. The strategy of scattering small garrisons along the border was quietly abandoned. Resources were consolidated into larger, more defensible bases. The emphasis shifted from territorial presence to population security in the major urban centers, an approach that more closely resembled the British model of counterinsurgency, though it was rarely described in those terms. The British contribution to this doctrinal evolution was significant, though it received little public recognition. British officers serving in coalition headquarters, British intelligence analysts working alongside American counterparts, and British special forces operating under Task Force Black had been demonstrating an alternative approach to counterinsurgency since 2003. Their methods, rooted in decades of experience that the American military was only beginning to accumulate, emphasized mobility over static defense, intelligence-led operations over area control, and the patient cultivation of human networks over the rapid deployment of technological solutions. The SAS, in particular, had shown what was possible when small, supremely trained units operated with the kind of tactical flexibility that static positions denied to conventional forces. While American garrisons at outposts like Keating were tied to defensive positions, absorbing attacks and waiting for reinforcement, SAS teams were moving through the same kind of terrain on foot, invisible, striking with precision and disappearing before the enemy could react. The contrast was not lost on the American Special Operations community, which studied British methods extensively and adopted many of their techniques in the years that followed. But the most profound lesson of COP Keating was not tactical. It was institutional. It was about the cost of ignoring experience, of dismissing warnings because they come from outside your own organizational culture, of failing to learn from people who have already paid the price for the mistakes you are about to make. The British had earned their knowledge in blood, in the streets of Belfast, where 763 British military personnel were killed during 38 years of operations. In the jungles of Malaya, where the II's campaign against communist insurgents lasted 12 years. In the mountains of Oman, where a handful of SAS soldiers fought a guerrilla war that lasted nearly a decade. In every one of these campaigns, the British had made mistakes, adapted, learned, and survived. And in every one of these campaigns, the central lesson was the same. Counterinsurgency is not about holding ground. It is about understanding the ground you're fighting on, the people who live on it, and the enemy who moves through it. And when the ground is against you, when every metric of tactical analysis says that your position is untenable, the bravest thing you can do is leave before the enemy proves you right. At COP Keating, the Americans held the ground. They held it with extraordinary courage, with acts of heroism that earned 2 Medals of Honor and dozens of lesser but no less meaningful awards for valor. They held it because they were told to hold it, because the system that put them there did not have the institutional flexibility to get them out in time. The British had warned that this would happen. They had said it in briefings, in intelligence assessments, in the quiet conversations that happen between Allied officers who share a war but not always a doctrine. They had said it with the authority of 6 decades of hard experience. They had said it because they had buried their own men in positions just as exposed, just as isolated, just as untenable. They had said it because they knew what it cost to learn this lesson the hard way, and they did not want to watch their allies pay the same price. The warning was ignored. And on a morning in October, in a valley at the edge of the world, the price was paid. 8 American soldiers who deserved better than the position they were given. 8 men whose courage was never in question, whose training was never in doubt, whose willingness to fight was absolute. 8 men who died not because they failed, but because the system that sent them into that valley had failed to listen to the people who already knew what happens when you put soldiers at the bottom of a hole and wait for the enemy to look down. Your men aren't ready, not because they lack courage, not because they lack training, not because they lack the will to fight. They're not ready because you've put them somewhere that no amount of courage, training, or will can defend. That was the warning. It came from people who had spent their careers learning exactly this lesson, in exactly this kind of terrain, against exactly this kind of enemy. The warning was right. It was always right, and the men who paid the price for its being ignored deserve to have this story told, not as an indictment of their valor, which was boundless, but as an indictment of the decisions that made their valor necessary. Because the measure of a military is not how bravely its soldiers fight from a bad position. It is whether its leaders have the wisdom to avoid putting them there in the first place. That is the lesson of COP Keating. That is the lesson the British tried to teach. And that is the lesson that was written, once again, in the only language that institutions seem to understand. The language of men who don't come home.